Okay, so you're here because, let's be honest, you want to really grasp the stuff that matters, right? Like cut through all the noise and get to the good stuff. Well, today we're diving into something pretty amazing. It's called 50 Most Popular and Prescribed Poems in English Literature. And it was put together by this guy, Dr. Jasvant Rathod.
Yeah, this is like a greatest hits collection. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? It's not just some random poems thrown together.
Right.
These are the poems that have really stuck with people, like across generations. Plus, they're the ones that keep showing up, in classrooms and anthologies.
Exactly. They're like the heavy hitters of poetry. So we're going to take a deep dive into these poems and see what we can learn. Why do these particular poems stick with us? Why do some poems get taught again and again while others kind of fade away? And what can these poems tell us about ourselves and the world? So what jumps out at you when you look at this list?
Well, one thing that's really interesting is that all these poems, even though they're so different from each other, they keep coming back to these big human questions, like love and death and beauty and the meaning of life. It's like these themes just keep echoing through the centuries. No matter how much things change, some things always stay the same.
Yeah, that's so true. Okay, so let's start with one of those big themes, love and beauty. Shakespeare has to be our starting point, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you think about love poems in English, you almost can't avoid Shakespeare. Like right away, Sonnet 18 pops into my head. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?
It's such a classic.
But what I find so fascinating about that sonnet is that it's not just about beauty. It's also about the power of art to kind of preserve beauty. Shakespeare is saying that even though summer days fade away, his poem will keep his beloved's beauty alive forever.
Wow. That's a really interesting way to look at it. So it's like he's using poetry to defeat time in a way.
Exactly. He's saying that art can be more powerful than nature in a sense. And then you have Sonnet 116, which takes a totally different approach. This one's all about the unshakable nature of true love. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, right?
Yeah. That's such a powerful line.
So Sonnet 18 is about the beauty of love, while Sonnet 116 is more about the strength and resilience of love.
I see what you mean. And how about Byron's She Walks in Beauty? That's another one that comes to mind when I think about love and beauty.
Right, and Byron's poem is interesting because it connects outward beauty to inward beauty. He sees the woman's physical beauty, but he also sees her mind at peace, serenely sweet. So it's like her inner goodness is what makes her truly beautiful.
That's a really nice thought. Like, beauty isn't just skin deep, it comes from within.
Exactly. And then you've got Sonnet 130, which is Shakespeare again, but this one's totally different. It's like he's making fun of all those over-the-top love poems.
Yeah, it's so funny. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun.
Right. He's basically saying, look, my love isn't perfect, but I love her anyway. It's kind of refreshing, actually. Like, he's being honest and realistic about love. It doesn't need all that fancy language and exaggerated comparisons.
So true. And of course, we can't forget Elizabeth Barrett Browning, How Do I Love Thee? That poem is just pure emotion.
It's so intense, right? The way she lists all the different ways she loves her husband, it's just so passionate and unrestrained.
It's like a love explosion.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about Shakespeare and Byron and Browning. What about Robert Burns? A Red, Red Rose is such a simple but beautiful love poem.
Oh, yeah. Burns is the master of simple language that just cuts right to the heart. And A Red, Red Rose is all about the depth and lasting power of love. It's like he's saying that even though flowers fade away, his love will never die.
It's amazing how he can convey so much emotion with such simple imagery. Okay, so let's move on to another big theme, death and the passage of time. It's interesting how many of these poems deal with these really heavy topics.
Well, death is one of those things that everyone has to face, right? It's a universal experience. And poets have always grappled with these big questions about mortality and what happens after we die, like Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, for instance.
What's going on in that poem?
So the speaker in the poem is listening to a nightingale singing, and he starts thinking about how short and painful human life is. The nightingale's song is so beautiful and timeless, but the speaker knows that he's going to die someday. So it's this bittersweet meditation on beauty and mortality and the desire to escape from suffering.
It's like he's looking for something permanent in a world that's always changing. And what about Emily Dickinson? She has such a unique way of talking about death, like in Because I Could Not Stop for Death.
Oh, yeah. That poem is so strange and wonderful. She personifies death as this polite gentleman who takes her on a carriage ride. It's like she's not afraid of death at all. She sees it as a natural part of life.
It's a really interesting way to think about it. Okay, so we've talked about Keats and Dickinson. Now what about Shelley's Ozymandias?
Ah, yes. Ozymandias is all about the fall of empires and how even the most powerful rulers eventually fade away. The poem describes this broken statue of a king in the desert, and it's like a warning about the fleeting nature of power and fame.
Yeah, it's a pretty sobering image. Like, no matter how great you are, eventually time will catch up with you.
Exactly. And then you have John Donne, who takes a totally different approach to death in Death Be Not Proud.
What's Donne's take?
Donne was this really intellectual poet, and he basically argues with death in this poem. He's like, you're not so scary, you're just a short sleep before we wake up in eternity. So he's using his intellect and his faith to kind of conquer his fear of death.
Wow, that's pretty bold. Okay, so what about Henry Vaughan's The Retreat? That one has a more nostalgic feel to it.
Yeah, Vaughan looks back on his childhood as this time of innocence and purity, and he sees death as a kind of return to that state. It's like a going back to the source.
It's a beautiful idea. Like, death isn't an ending, but a homecoming.
Okay, so we've covered love and beauty and death. What about the way these poems engage with social and political issues?
Yeah, that's another really important aspect of this list. A lot of these poems reflect the specific historical and social contexts in which they were written, and they offer these really interesting insights into how people were thinking and feeling about the world around them.
Like Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott, for instance.
Right, The Lady of Shalott can be seen as a commentary on the restrictions that Victorian society placed on women. She's trapped in this tower, and she can only experience the world through a mirror. And when she tries to break free, she ends up dying. It's like a tragedy about the dangers of isolation and the longing for freedom.
It's a really sad story. And then you have Browning's My Last Duchess, which is just creepy. Oh, yeah. My Last Duchess is like a portrait of a controlling and possessive husband. The Duke is showing off this painting of his dead wife, and he's basically bragging about how he had her killed because she was too friendly and independent. It's a really disturbing poem, but it says a lot about the power dynamics between men and women in that era.
It's chilling. Okay, so we've talked about Tennyson and Browning. What about Matthew Arnold? His poem Dover Beach captures a lot of the anxieties of the Victorian age.
Right. Arnold was writing during this time of huge social and intellectual upheaval, and Dover Beach reflects that sense of uncertainty and disillusionment. The poem talks about how faith is fading and the world feels like it's falling apart. It's a really powerful expression of the anxieties of that era.
You can just feel the doubt and pessimism in those lines.
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about war. This list includes some incredibly moving war poems, like Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est, for instance.
Yeah. Dulce et Decorum Est is one of the most famous and powerful war poems ever written. Owen fought in World War I, and he saw firsthand the horrors of trench warfare. And his poem doesn't hold back. It describes the brutal reality of war in graphic detail, and it directly challenges the idea that it's sweet and fitting to die for one's country.
It's a really harrowing poem. And then you have Siegfried Sassoon, who takes a more satirical approach to war in base details.
Yeah, Sassoon was also a World War I veteran,
Yeah.
and he was really critical of the military leaders who sent young men to their deaths. Base Details is a satirical attack on those leaders who were sitting comfortably back home while the soldiers were suffering in the trenches.
That's a really sharp and cynical poem. And then there's W.H. Auden's September 1st, 1939, which was written at the start of World War II.
Right. Auden's poem reflects the sense of dread and foreboding that many people felt at the outbreak of war. He talks about the low, dishonest decade that led up to the war, and he tries to make sense of the political and social forces that brought the world to this point.
It's a really complex and thought-provoking poem.
Okay, and what about Randall Jarrell's The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner? That one is just devastating.
Yeah. The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner is a very short poem, but it packs a huge emotional punch. It describes the death of a gunner in a bomber plane during World War II. And the way Jarrell writes about it, it's just so cold and impersonal. It really highlights the dehumanizing nature of modern warfare.
It's a really powerful reminder of the human cost of war. Okay, so we've talked about some of the more traditional war poems, but it's important to acknowledge that this list also includes some really powerful poems by poets from marginalized communities.
Absolutely. Like Maya Angelou's Still I Rise, for instance.
Yeah.
That poem is an anthem of resilience and hope. It's about overcoming adversity and refusing to be silenced.
It's such a powerful and inspiring poem. And what about Audre Lorde's A Litany for Survival?
Lorde's poem speaks to the experiences of people who have been marginalized and oppressed, and it's about finding strength and solidarity in the face of those challenges. It's a really important message. And then there's Langston Hughes's The Negro Speaks of Rivers.
Hughes's poem is a beautiful celebration of Black history and heritage. It connects the speaker to the ancient rivers of Africa, and it speaks to the resilience and endurance of Black people throughout history.
It's a really moving and powerful poem. And then there's Claude McKay's If We Must Die, which is a call to resistance against oppression.
McKay's poem is a sonnet, and it's full of this righteous anger and defiance. It's about refusing to die like animals and instead fighting back against injustice with courage and dignity.
It's a really inspiring poem. And then there's County Cullen's Yet Do I Marvel, which explores the complexities of faith and racial identity.
Cullen's poem is a really interesting meditation on the problem of evil. He's wrestling with the question of why a good God would allow suffering and injustice to exist. And he's also grappling with the specific challenges of being Black in America.
It's a really thought-provoking poem. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about love and death and war and social justice. Now let's talk about nature.
Yeah, nature is another one of those big themes that poets have always been drawn to. And this list includes some really beautiful nature poems, like Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, for instance.
That's one of my favorites.
Mine too. It's such a simple and joyful poem. It's about the power of nature to lift our spirits and inspire us. The speaker is feeling lonely, and then he sees this field of daffodils, and it just fills him with joy. And that feeling stays with him long after he's left the field.
It's a really beautiful image. And then you have Blake's The Tiger and the Lamb, which take a more symbolic approach to nature.
Right. Blake was a very mystical poet, and his poems are full of symbolism and allegory. The tiger and the lamb are both about creation and the nature of good and evil. The tiger represents power and fear, while the lamb represents innocence and gentleness.
They're like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
And then there's Gerard Manley Hopkins, who had this really unique way of writing about nature.
Yeah, Hopkins was a Jesuit priest, and his poetry is very spiritual and intense. He uses all these unusual words and rhythms to try to capture the beauty and energy of the natural world, like in Pied Beauty, for instance.
What's that poem about?
Pied Beauty is all about finding beauty in the diversity of nature. Hopkins celebrates the dappled things, the things that are mixed and varied and imperfect, and he sees God's hand in all of it.
It's a really interesting way to look at the world. Okay, so we've talked about Wordsworth and Blake and Hopkins. Now what about H.D.? Her poem Oread is a really good example of imagism.
Right. H.D. was part of this group of poets called the Imagists, and they were all about using clear and precise imagery to create a strong emotional response. Oread is a very short poem, but it's incredibly vivid and evocative. It's about a sea nymph who longs to be part of the forest.
It's a really beautiful poem. Okay, so let's talk about poems that are about poetry itself, like C. Massini's Digging, for instance.
Yeah, Digging is a really interesting poem about the relationship between the poet and his family history. Heaney's father and grandfather were both farmers, and in the poem, Heaney compares his own work as a poet to their work digging in the earth. He's saying that both are forms of labor that uncover something hidden and valuable.
It's a really beautiful metaphor. And then there's Walt Whitman, who basically wrote an entire poem about himself in Song of Myself.
Yeah, Whitman was all about celebrating the individual and the common man, and Song of Myself is this huge, sprawling poem that encompasses all of human experience. It's about love and death and nature and the city and everything in between.
It's a really ambitious and groundbreaking poem.
Yeah.
And then there's Edmund Spenser, who writes about the power of poetry to immortalize beauty in Sonnet 75.
Yeah, Spenser was a Renaissance poet, and he was really into the idea of using poetry to achieve immortality. In Sonnet 75, he's trying to write his beloved's name in the sand, but the waves keep washing it away. So he realizes that the only way to truly preserve her beauty is through his poetry.
It's a really romantic idea. Okay, and then there's Marianne Moore, who takes a more modern and skeptical approach to poetry in her poem, Poetry.
Yeah, Moore was a modernist poet, and she was really critical of traditional poetry. She thought that a lot of poetry was too sentimental and artificial. So in her poem Poetry, she argues for a more authentic and genuine kind of poetry. She wants poetry that is grounded in real experience and that uses precise language.
That's a really interesting perspective. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different themes and styles, but one thing that really stands out about this list is the sheer variety of forms that are represented. You've got sonnets and free verse and dramatic monologues and all sorts of other things.
Yeah, it's really amazing to see the range of poetic forms that have been used throughout history. It's like poets are always experimenting with new ways to express themselves, like the Imagists, for instance.
Remind me about the Imagists.
The Imagists were all about creating clear and vivid images in their poems. They used very spare and precise language, and they avoided any kind of extraneous detail. Their goal was to capture the essence of a moment or an object in a few words.
It's a really interesting style. And then there are the metaphysical poets like John Donne and Andrew Marvell.
Yeah, the metaphysical poets were known for their intellectual wit and their use of elaborate metaphors. They were interested in exploring complex philosophical and religious ideas.
And how about George Herbert? He was a metaphysical poet too, right?
Yeah, Herbert was a very devout Christian, and his poetry is full of religious imagery and symbolism. His poems are often very personal and introspective.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Let's talk about some of the poems that are maybe a little more challenging or enigmatic, like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, for instance.
Yeah, The Wasteland is one of those poems that you can read 100 times and still find new things in it. It's a very complex and fragmented poem that reflects the disillusionment and despair of post-World War I Europe.
It's a really powerful poem, but it can be pretty tough to understand. And then there's Yeats' The Second Coming, which is another one of those poems that feels really relevant today.
Yeah, The Second Coming is about the collapse of civilization and the rise of something new and terrifying. It's a really apocalyptic poem, and it captures a lot of the anxiety and uncertainty that we're feeling in the world today.
It's definitely a poem that stays with you. Okay, so what about Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken? That one seems pretty straightforward, but it's actually quite ambiguous.
Yeah, The Road Not Taken is one of those poems that everyone thinks they understand, but the more you think about it, the more complex it becomes. It's ostensibly about making choices, but it's also about the stories we tell ourselves about our choices.
It's a really thought-provoking poem.
Okay.
Okay, and then there's Rudyard Kipling's If, which is basically a guide to being a good man.
Yeah, Kipling was a very Victorian writer, and his poem If reflects those Victorian values of stoicism and self-reliance. It's a very prescriptive poem, but it's also very inspiring.
Okay, so what about Wallace Stevens? His poem, The Emperor of Ice Cream, is one of the strangest poems on this list.
Yeah, Stevens was a modernist poet, and his poems are often very abstract and surreal. The Emperor of Ice Cream is about death and the fleeting nature of pleasure. It's a very strange and unsettling poem, but it's also very beautiful in its own way.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different individual poems, but what about the list as a whole? What are some of the big takeaways that we can glean from this collection?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is the sheer diversity of voices and perspectives that are represented. This list includes poems by men and women, by people from all different backgrounds and from all different time periods. And yet, despite all that diversity, there are also some common threads that run through these poems.
What do you
Well, I think all of these poems in their own way are trying to make sense of the human experience. They're trying to grapple with the big questions about life and death and love and loss. And they're trying to find beauty and meaning in a world that can often be chaotic and confusing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think another takeaway is the power of language. These poems are all so beautifully written, and they show us how language can be used to express the most complex and nuanced emotions.
Absolutely. And I think the final takeaway is that poetry is for everyone. It's
Mhm.
not just for academics or intellectuals. It's for anyone who has ever felt something deeply or who has ever wondered about the world around them.
That's a great point. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. Which of these poems resonated with you the most, and why? I think taking some time to reflect on that question can tell you a lot about yourself and about the things that are important to you.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I would add that even if you didn't connect with any of these poems, that's okay too. There are so many other great poems out there just waiting to be discovered. So keep exploring and keep reading. You never know what you might find.
It's a great note to end on. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, keep diving.